I'm very glad to greet everybody who is here, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to our first speaker, whose name is Anthony Carty. He is well known for lawyers. He is a specialist in international law, especially in international law in Asia, in philosophy in international law. He graduated from Belfast University, and he made his PhD in Cambridge. He published several well-known books. The best known are Philosophy of International Law, Decay of International Law. And recently, this year, he published a book about South China Sea issue. And now he's teaching in Beijing Technological University. And his report will relate to Palestinian issue. And also, I would like to introduce you our audience. Our audience consists of specialists in Oriental studies, lawyers. We have several professors of international law from different cities of Russia, and we have several Chinese and maybe Russian students. They're here. So, Tony, I'm very glad to say you good evening, and I give you word.
So I have a short speech to make, and it's very extreme and very strong. It's Middle East and international law, but I'm only going to talk about Israel and express my views, and maybe there will be some discussion later. I have made an in-depth study of the Israel-Palestine question, which I did when I did a review article for the prestigious London School of Economics Law Journal, the Modern Law Review, in 2013 in volume 76. It was about a 25 to 30-page article reviewing a book by Victor Katan, who's an English-Palestinian international lawyer who acts on behalf of Palestine in many different contexts. And his book is called From Conquest to Coexistence to Conquest. His book is historical and looks at the British archives in the setting up of Israel between the Balfour Declaration, before the Balfour Declaration, and the independence of Israel. It stops around 1950. And I then, for the purpose of doing this review, Israel's right to exist against the Palestinian right to self-determination. And my approach to this was to spend about 6 months reading through almost exclusively Israeli historians and their archival work on the founding of Israel. I think particularly a fellow called Morris, and they built their work on the diaries of the Israeli political leaders at the time, but more especially the Israeli security forces, military forces, and guerrilla forces. And the conclusion from that, from Israeli sources, and I'm sure I'm saying something that you all already know, is that the foundation of Israel was a deliberately terrorist undertaking to kill, as far as necessary, Palestinian inhabitants of the territory of Palestine in order to terrorize what came to about 750,000 Palestinians, abandoning their homes and abandoning their land and having that land seized by Israel. So this was the basis of the foundation of Israel. The historians, particularly Morris, tend to argue that, well, this was survival of the fittest, and the Palestinians were rather inferior people, and if they had known how to organize themselves, they could have fought back, but they were pretty hopeless, and so not much pity or tears should be spilled for them. So this is how Israel was founded, and this is uncontested. The Modern Law Review is published by the London School of Economics Law Faculty, and it has a large Jewish staff and influence. So this had to go through a very severe and rigorous review process. It was sent back to me several times before they agreed to publish the review article. Now, coming from this foundation of the State of Israel, there is some controversy about whether how systematic the terrorist enterprise of the Israeli forces was, whether it was deliberately planned by the Israeli cabinet, Ben-Gurion, or whether it simply was a spontaneous exercise which developed and evolved. It seems that according to this fellow Pate, I think, who's a refugee now, an Israeli refugee in England, it was pre-planned and premeditated. Now, the outcome of this setting up of the State of Israel, this land grab, is, in my view, that the ethos or the natural being of the State of Israel continues to be what it was from its foundation. I have been trying in my philosophy of international law to say that the character of a country is determined by the way in which it is founded and by its historical background and its historical traditions. And this is a country which is founded on the basis of grabbing land from Palestinians, killing them, getting rid of them, and expanding on that basis. And this has not changed. And this is a natural ethos of the country that continues to this day. Now, following this setting up of the State of Israel, it was admitted to the United Nations, and there was a general recognition of Israel as a state by most countries. But not exactly, according to the researches I've done, there wasn't exactly a consensus about the boundaries of Israel. But the state itself was recognized de facto and de jure by most of the international community as a state. It may be asked what this recognition is worth, but that involves asking what international law is worth, which is what I really want to come to. That's why I believe in the necessity for a study of the philosophy of international law. I noticed in the article, when I was doing this research for the article, that there is a so-called Cambridge Good School of International Law, which considered that since Palestine was not recognized as a state, the Israeli actions could not at the time in 1947-48 be taken to be a violation of the UN Charter Article 2.4, which only protects states. And Catton has made the point in his very exhaustive historical review that the Institute of International Law around 1930 said that Palestine as a mandate territory did, under the terms of the League of Nations Covenant and the terms of the mandate, it did have an international legal personality which had to be respected. But anyway, that was obviously simply the view of a non-governmental, organization, and it doesn't seem to be very much taken into account. So basically, we are already considering, in my view, the problematic nature of international law. What does recognition mean? I mean, the Ukraine is recognized as a state at the moment, but that is an issue that could be questioned certainly by Russia, and I have my own views about that. Now, the second point I want to make, which also affects the basic structure of international law, and I come to this whole question from a kind of theoretical point of view. And of course, there are many other aspects to the history of the Middle East, and going back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the decisions taken at the Peace of Lausanne and the Peace of Sèvres, but I'm not going to go into that. My second point is that Israel insists in its legal position that it has the sole right to decide what its self-defense requires. It is the sole judge. It insisted upon this already in 1947 and 1948 before the United Nations Security Council, and it continues to insist on this. And that does then what is happening in Syria, not to mention what has been happening in Gaza, is based on an Israeli concept of preemptive attack, of anticipation of possible threats from terrorists to the security of Israel, and that Israel itself is the only authority on earth that has the legal power to decide what is required. So this is a second point, which I think raises a very difficult question about the nature of international law, because the claim of preemptive attack, as has also been pointed out by my friend and colleague Vladislav, this is a claim that is made by other countries, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and indeed also arguably Russia, in the context of the Ukraine and the expansion of NATO as being a threat to Russian security. Now, the third point I want to make is that there are explanations offered for why countries such as the United Kingdom and the United States, etc., are prepared to support Israel, France as well. Germany is a special case, that they equally have a settler colonial foundation, which has always assumed that the original inhabitants of a country, that of the non-Western world, that was in a condition that could not be treated as equal to that of a sovereign Western state, could, as a matter of international law, be dispossessed and even exterminated. I mean, the standard textbook case on international law of territory is the island of Palma's case, where the arbitrator did not consider that the native population of the island of Palmas, however it was organized, needed to be taken into account in determining whether or not the island of Palmas belonged to the United States or whether it belonged to Holland. So this is integrally built into the whole ethos of international law, that when you're in this so-called non-Western environment, that the whole culture of a country like the United States, based upon, and I know what I'm saying is controversial, but based upon the elimination of the indigenous population, that it feels quite indifferent to further eliminations of populations. And of course, I come from Ireland. Belfast is part of Ireland, or that's a controversial matter. Well, a contested matter. It's actually regulated by the Belfast Agreement, that in the event that the majority of the population wished to transfer to the south of Ireland, then the British government would accept that, a very liberal, open view. But anyway, basically, the history of the West is very much a matter of dispossession of non-Western territories. And this is why there is a kind of double standard applied by the West when it comes to Palestine, Israel, and Gaza, compared to the Western outrage and fury over the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. And there is I'm a member of the London Review of International Law, which has done a special issue in July of this year on the Gaza crisis. And there's a joint article by about 3 international lawyers from Canada and Australia, which are also settler countries, I say countries based upon the elimination or the sidetracking or the removal of the local population, that this is actually a driving force and a consideration to be taken into account in explaining what is going on at the moment. And as I understand it, many of you are not international lawyers and are therefore perhaps more open to considering issues of this more general, not easily verifiable, but probably relevant consideration. The fourth point I want to make, I have about 6 points to make. The fourth point I want to make is that in my view, and this is also controversial, there is a judicial process taking place at the moment to determine whether or not, before the International Court of Justice, whether or not Israel is guilty of genocide. There has been an advisory opinion that its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza are illegal and that it should vacate these territories. And there is now a prospect, not a very strong one, but there is a prospect of the prosecution of the leaders, 2 of the leaders of Israel for war crimes. In my view, this is fine, and I'm all in favor of it, and I don't want to belittle these efforts, but it is obvious as a matter of jurisprudence and of legal theory that these mechanisms do not offer any significant support or guarantee of protection to the Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, not to mention the people of Lebanon and now the people of Syria, who are the subject of massive air attacks from Israel. So I personally do not think that this judicial process is of much interest, and I'm not bothering to follow it. As far as I'm aware, Israel has paid no attention whatsoever, either to the preliminary measures of the International Court of Justice on the genocide case or to the advisory opinion. Number 5, instead, though it is a more helpful, I think, we have to realize that this crisis proves that there is no ontological, philosophical foundation for the positive international law on the use of force and humanitarian law. The complicity of Arab Middle Eastern countries has to be recognized. There are very close relations of these Arab Middle East countries with the United States, the elites of these countries, is something that one needs to rethink to the very foundations of what international law morality are about. It seems to me that on top of that, there is a certain amount of outrage in the international community about what is happening, but there is a general acquiescence in this conduct by Israel, which is supported firmly by NATO powers and particularly by the United States and the United Kingdom. And to my mind, that really does mean that we need to wonder what on earth is the whole fabric of international law worth. There is something very deeply disturbing about the very foundation of the Western attempts to create an international order. One can talk, and this is one of the reasons I'm in China. I'm a visiting professor at the moment for the last year in the University of Peking Law Faculty, where I'm a distinguished foreign lecturer giving a series of lectures on the foundations of international law. And what one is trying to do, and I've been trying to do this also with Vladislav in our conversations and in our writings, we really are needing to go back to absolute foundations and say, are there any fundamental standards that the international community thinks are sacred and cannot be violated? Because it is obvious at the moment that that does not seem to be the case. And I think the reason for it has to be also the overwhelming military dominance of the United States. I mean, it is a hard fact, for all my huffing and puffing and outrage, it is a hard fact that America is a country of overwhelming military power, and it is unreserved in its support of Israel. That support is likely to increase once Donald Trump comes into power. So I think the West, European civilization, of which Russia is very much a part, is facing an existential crisis as severe the way it is developing as the beginning of the Second World War. And really, it keeps me awake at night, and I have no easy answers. But it is why I'm attempting the philosophy of international law. So I thank Vladislav for giving me this forum to express these views, and I hope at some point I can actually come to Moscow and actually talk with you. I mean, because of this, to make this kind of speech online without being able to interact physically with the people with whom I'm speaking is less than satisfactory, though better than nothing. So thank you very much, Vladislav.
Thank you, Tony, colleagues. Does anybody have some questions?
Yes, please, if possible, Vladislav.
Ergali, introduce yourself and then ask question.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Ergali Bayaltinov. I'm from Kazakhstan. Mr. Carty, I would like to ask you about your view, personal view, on what is happening actually in Middle East. I mean, in Syria, and what is being to be happen in nearest future to your mind, everything is absolute. This is the absolute chaos. What is happening actually in Syria and in the territories close to Israel, and actually Israel mastered the Golan Heights, and Kurdish troops are also going to fight with Turkish troops, and there is a possible view that maybe there will be some reorganization of the order in the Middle East. I mean, is there any possibility of appearing of Kurdistan in a new area, which is freed in Syria? And also, how do you personally see the development of the situation in this area? Thank you.
Well, I'm very grateful to you for that question, because I have actually done quite a lot of research on the history of the Syria conflict and looked at various different sources. And particularly, there is a Swiss historian called David Ganser, and then there is an English expert, former diplomat and intelligence officer living in Beirut called Alistair Crook, and they confirm with other sources that I've read that from the time of Obama, the decision was, the following decision was taken. It was proposed by Qatar and Saudi Arabia that there should be an oil pipeline through Syria from Qatar to Turkey and Europe in order to sideline Russia as the main provider of cheap oil and gas for Europe. And Assad did not go along with this because he realized that the purpose of this project from the American point of view was to sideline Russia and to sideline Iran. And so he refused, and that at that point, already in 2008, before the so-called Arab Spring, the decision was taken in Washington and London that, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, that Assad was to be overthrown. This government was to be removed, and the regime was to be removed, and a regime would be put in place that would favor the project of the oil pipeline. Now, when 2011 began, then the opportunity after the destruction of the Gaddafi government by the United States, France, and Britain, the weapons of Gaddafi's forces were transferred by the Americans and the British to the to Islamicist Al Qaeda and other forces in Syria, and so the main part of the uprising against Assad was a violent uprising. Russia came in to try and stop that in 2016, but basically it's the same forces that are now have now overthrown the Assad regime. And it's fairly common knowledge in the American social media that the United States and Britain have been supporting Al Qaeda-like organizations that were linked to those who committed the 9/11 atrocity in New York in 2001. So what we are faced with, according to Emmanuel Todd, who's written a very famous book that's well received in Russia called The Defeat of Europe, La défaite de l'Europe, it's in French, that basically there is a radical nihilism driving British and American foreign policy based upon, in his view, the collapse of Christianity as a restraining moral force among American and British elites. And that is basically what has been happening now. Turkey was also involved in this conspiracy to destroy Assad. And it's all coming home to roost. I mean, I think the situation, the seriousness of this situation can hardly be exaggerated. I have no doubt that part of this military strategy will include undermining and overthrowing the government of Iran, because the whole psychological structure of the way the Americans think is to cut off as much oil and gas from China as possible. China needs Iran. I mean, I don't know how much China can have all its oil supplied by Russia. I mean, the situation is absolutely devastating, and it has been my conviction for most of my career. I mean, I wrote The Decay of International Law already in 1986. That, I mean, the positive international law rests on nothing at all. And I see no future for the international community through the Western powers. It has to come from some attempt to save the international community from the global south through BRICS, through Russia, China, India, and Brazil and South Africa. It's South Africa that's bringing these legal actions before the court. I cannot possibly say that the situation has any merit to it. It has been brought about by the utter nihilistic ruthlessness of the United States, that considers it's entitled to overthrow any government that gets in its way. And that applies to Russia as well. I mean, that's why Britain and America prevented the Ukraine from reaching a compromise with Russia at the end of March, beginning of April. I accept that narrative. I know all of this is contested. So I can do nothing to assuage the situation. It is part of the picture. And I don't see where, in God's name, I don't see where it's going to end. Though I think it's unlikely that Russia or China are going to risk a third world war over anything that's happening in the Middle East, which is a course of. So the more and more I study the actual diplomatic practice of the Western powers, the more I become alarmed at what is going on. So that would be my answer. I have no consolation.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Anna Novikova, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Carty. My name is Anna Novikova. I am a senior research fellow at the Department of Israel and Jewish Communities at the Institute of Oriental Studies of Russian Academy of Science. Thank you very much for your presentation today. My question to you is the following one. If the international order and the powers that support the current international order, which you say is, of course, the undominated American military presence and military interests, if they recede to the sidelines, considering that there is an isolationist tendency to the possible incoming Trump administration due to the current picks for various government roles, what do you think could happen to the international order, and how can it affect the Middle East if Donald Trump and his administration truly pursue the more isolationist approach? Thank you very much.
Well, one would like to think that it could make a significant difference. And I've been following this. I mean, it's outside my expertise as an international lawyer, but I don't think much of international law. And I think it's my main problem as a philosopher of international law is to search wherever I can for any ethical or rational foundation for international order. So I spend most of my time actually studying international events as best I can. My view is that it does seem that Trump is, if that is at all possible, even more fanatical in support of Israel than Biden, and that he is very heavily funded by Jewish money in the Jewish lobby in the United States, and he's very comfortable about that. The only hope is that the man is totally unpredictable and whimsical, and it could be possible that for one way or another, he could offend. He could be offended by some aspect of what Israel is doing and then turn against it. He is likely to bring, as far as he can, the war in the Ukraine, the quarrel with Russia, to an end. He's not a cold warrior. And so he doesn't have the his attitude towards Israel is not typical of his general international attitude. He's not a regime-changing neocon, but he has appointed a whole series of, in fact, virtually all of his appointees to all his senior positions, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, they're all neocons just as much as the Biden regime, and all is hostile to Russia as the present American government. So I'm not too hopeful. At least he's a little bit unpredictable. There are Americans. Mersheimer is a very popular figure at the moment because of his distancing himself from United States policy in relation to Russia. But underlying the desire to withdraw from conflict with Russia is the desire to focus on conflict with China. So they're not actually promising. They're not actually promising a much improved situation. So my answer to you is that for myself, as for everybody else, the best that one can say about Trump is that he's totally unpredictable. Trump is relying upon isolation, so-called isolationist policies. I mean, from my view of the United States is that it has enormous internal social and economic problems, and its economy is lopsided with enormous levels of debt attributable to its extremely expansive military policies around the world, which nonetheless, it can sustain through its control of the dollar as a world reserve currency, and also through the role that its military industrial complex can actually feed off the business of selling weapons to the Ukraine, to Taiwan, to South Korea, to Australia, to Japan, to Germany. Germany has recently purchased an enormous amount of weaponry. So there are objective conditions within America which do favor an isolationist policy, and Trump it is conceivable or possible that in some respects he might follow that policy. I think it would be wonderful for the world if Trump was to simply turn around to NATO and say that this is an outdated and useless organization and we're not going to continue supporting it. But I think that I don't hold out a great deal. The only person he seems to have appointed who would be a figure in the other direction is this Gibbard lady from Hawaii, who has been put in charge of the Government Information Service. So she will be the person who has access to all the intelligence that comes to the American government and will be then channeling it to Trump and to other people. And she is a liberal Democrat who left the Democratic Party because of its policies towards Russia and towards Israel. So it's not a very satisfactory answer. I'm not very hopeful. And certainly I don't think Trump will make much difference in the Middle East. So I'm sorry if I can't be more helpful there.
I.M, thank you. And Abdul Kadir Gajimenov, your questions, please.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mr. Carty, for your presentation. My name is Abdul Kadir Gajimenov, and I'm a master's student of international law from Moscow. I have a specific question regarding the recent change in international legal discourse, which was initiated by Western leaders. There's little research on the fact that Western leaders are now invoking so-called rule-based order instead of international law when they're accusing non-Western players of any violations of the rules that they seem abiding upon them. And my question, somebody wrote that it seems to have become a job requirement for a top position in the US foreign policy to refer to rule-based order instead of international law. And my question is, do you think that this is an intentional strategy aimed at changing the whole discourse of international law by interfering and trying to replace the core terminology that lawyers use? Thanks.
Well, my understanding of this, I mean, the Moscow Institute for International Relations legal department has done an extensive article as you probably are aware, determining that as far as the use of this concept is concerned, it has not got any definite or precise meaning, and it's not elaborated as to what it means. It doesn't seem to be, I'm not aware that it is elaborated by international lawyers very much, either in America or anywhere else. The view in China, which I share, the view of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, head of the Chinese Foreign Ministry legal department, is that basically this is code for the enforcement of a neoliberal international democratic market economy on the world, so that it is basically a determination to overthrow any regime that is not neoliberal democratic in its sense, and that would therefore justify having, I don't know, white or blue or yellow revolutions in Belarus and Russia and China and wherever to overthrow any government that is not liberal democratic. That is what it really means. And that is certainly the view of the Chinese, that it is basically a widening of the concept of humanitarian intervention to include intervention to overthrow any government that has economic policies that are hostile to or present obstacles to the neoliberal corporatist free market international banking system that exists. And so I understand from following social media groups and following think tanks in the United States that it is the intention of the American government under Trump fairly quickly to proceed to an overthrow of the government of Venezuela. And so this is what would be meant by the neoliberal this would be meant by the rules-based international order. But I mean, as I understand it, and I have spent a lot of time studying it, I can't find anything that would satisfy a lawyer that this concept had any definite meaning. So I can't really, I would be happy to think that it might have some meaning, but I mean, your colleagues in Moscow Institute of International Relations were not able to find any meaning, and their study of this was pretty exhaustive and not very interesting, because they simply quoted one statement after another made by various different leaders in Australia and Canada and so on. I think there is a vacuousness at the top in the elite governing the United States and the United Kingdom, which has to be seen to be believed. There is no intellectual content. It's hot air. And one is dealing in a kind of nihilistic vacuum. And I think it is important to take to heart the work of Emmanuel Todd and his book, The Defeat of the West, because he is trying to grapple with what I think is the fundamental problem of a kind of nihilistic will to power. I mean, Alistair Crooke, who is an established English diplomat honored by the monarchy in Britain with awards for his distinction to service and widely praised by the British diplomatic class. And he says, what one has to appreciate is that the United States is determined to do whatever it takes to maintain its preeminence in international society. If that means the complete destruction of the state of Syria, then that's simply what is necessary. Even if it just means installing a pipeline that enables Qatar to transfer its oil through Turkey to Western Europe. That's where we are. And these vacuous terms, the various vacuousness of these terms, vacuity of these terms, is the phenomenon that international relations scholars need to work with. I would hope that in Russia there would be a more serious reflection, or could be a more serious reflection on these questions.
Okay. And may I ask also two questions? My first question is, I agree with you that international law is experiencing a shortage of moral foundations, as is in a need of transformation. but it cannot happen automatically. So my question is, what do you consider as a driving force of this transformation? Who will transform international law? Some state, some person, some culture, some party, or who?
Well, this is going to lead you to smile. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's we're trying to do it in Beijing. We tried to do it. I tried to do it in a project when I was in Hong Kong with Chinese young Chinese researchers, and we tried to produce a study called Ancient Chinese Virtues and Renaissance Pre-Modern European Humanist Values, contesting or accepting the validity of the critique of modern international law put forward by Richard Tuck in his book about From Grotius to Kant. And in other words, the answer would have to be that it has to come from the foundations, from intellectuals, but it has to have a spiritual foundation. It is not a purely intellectual foundation, and therefore it is not very promising. But I have very little patience myself personally. I know we have discussed this ourselves. I have very little patience with the kind of radical nihilism that simply says, well, this situation is absolutely hopeless and we cannot recover from it. I mean, I am familiar with that, and I find it very tempting. Nietzsche, Agamben, Foucault, and so on. But I've had my postmodern phase. I think I regard it as an adolescent phase. And moral responsibility does mean that we have to struggle. And it will not be done by international lawyers. There may be one or two international lawyers. It will be done by political thinkers. I'm very hopeful that Paris, in my view, is one of the most promising places for these kinds of reflections, where they have gone through their postmodern phase as an adolescent phase. That it's time to pass. So I see it as a very long term and very, very dangerous, because in the meantime, I do see it as a global exercise. I do see in the United States great work being done by people like Christopher. I mean, Chomsky is now very, very old. I'm pretty old myself. But there are people like Christopher Hedges, people like Jeremy Sachs and Morsheimer. There are many, many vigorous American intellectuals who have seen through the military-industrial state and the sham character of American democracy. So I think social criticism. I believe that violence is not a solution. There is no way that one can kind of storm the Summer Palace or Winter Palace or whatever, or storm the palace of Assad in Syria. It has to be an intellectual, spiritual revolution which catches on in society. And that will take a generation. And in the meantime, we are in a very, very precarious situation.
Okay. And may I ask the second question? My second question is related to Middle East. Yeah, I agree with you when you impute problems of the region to external actors, to external factors, to US, to Israel, to NATO. But what about endogenous factors? What about themselves? I mean that, do you think that they are enough mature to build states, to build institutions, to build an order? I mean that if we look at the history of the region, we see that they were under power of.
Come back in again. I was cut out for a few seconds. This is a very, I mean, I don't know everything about everything, but I have thought about this. What one view is that one really, and I was been trying to argue to this in a public lecture I gave today to the Chinese, who unfortunately are very sanguine people who are very happy and contented with themselves and with the world, and it's quite difficult to get them to have any sense of alarm about whatever is going on anywhere. But basically, I believe that I follow the narrative that the United States is behind most of the governments in the Middle East, and particularly Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Gulf Arab Emirates. So, I mean, they're as thick as thieves with these anti-democratic regimes, which are completely out of touch with the popular opinion in their countries. And so America is really part of the problem. One can, beyond that, it's very difficult to say. The secular, liberal, socialist policies of the 50s and the 60s of the Ba'ath Party and in Syria and Iraq and Egypt, all of this has gone very sour. And we are now confronted with Islamic fundamentalism. I am not, as a religious person myself, particularly horrified by the idea that Islamic values have real social force. I do believe that there is a possibility of some kind of ontological compromise with Islam, between Islam and Greco-Christian and Roman Christian civilization. However, I think that there is a further dimension, and you will know this as well as I do. The Middle East has been defined by the treaties of Sèvres and Lausanne and the decision of the British and the French to make empires for themselves there in 1919 with disastrous consequences. I mean, France is at the origin of all the problems in Syria. It built up the Assad regime and suppressed the Sunni Islamic population of Syria. It was the French who carved out Lebanon and so on, and then the British, of course, carved out Kuwait in order to be able to control about 50% of the oil that would otherwise have belonged to Iraq, and so on and so forth. Iraq itself was an invention of the British for their own particular. It was a toy of Winston Churchill brought about through the use of the Royal Air Force to massacre the population, the tribal regions that opposed the unification of Iraq. The failure to set up a Kurdish state after Sèvres to Lausanne. I mean, the issues are monumental, and I think that the situation is so hopeless because you cannot expect in an international society that individual countries can solve these problems. I mean, historically, European problems were solved by the cooperation of the great powers through the great peace treaties. And what is needed, both in the East Asia and in the Middle East, is a concert of the major powers: China, Russia, European Union, America, India, to come together and to impose a reasonably just solution. And that is inconceivable. That is inconceivable. So, I mean, I'm not optimistic. I think that it would be racist to say that Arab communities are not capable of organizing themselves. They have been so badly treated, but particularly by America, which is a country which is itself is responsible for destroying the social fabric of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Syria, of Libya, and distorting the fabric of Egypt and other Gulf Arab states. Britain has played a mighty role there. Britain set up Oman and Muscat. It set up the Yemen. It set up Kuwait and Qatar. These are all inventions of British diplomacy, constructed for the purposes of British oil interests and so on. It's one almighty mess. I would think that in the short term, if the Islamic fundamentalists desire, I've had taught many Arab students, not Iranian students, but Arab students in my time in the United Kingdom when I was a professor in Aberdeen and in Derby and Westminster. The basic tenet of Islamic fundamentalism is to expel the West from the Middle East. I mean, they are shooting one another most of the time, but that is basically what they all want. And that I think, in the short term, is what is required. After that, leave them to themselves. Leave them to themselves and see what they can do. That would be my advice. What we can do, and Russia can play a role there, and China perhaps, but China is very, very cautious, is to expel the West from the Middle East. And that means expelling the arms industries and the oil companies. It doesn't just mean removing a few silly American bases. Expelling the West from the Middle East means withdrawing, and that means actually an overthrow of the regimes, which are intricately linked not merely to the Anglo-American arms industry, but to the whole banking system in New York and London. I mean, they are managing, London and New York are managing the whole finances of the Middle East. So quite a mess. But academia in the West, I think, is very largely a waste of time. I mean, you won't get any funding from the British Art and Humanities Research Council to study any of these questions. You could get lots of money to study the problem of terrorism or problem of immigration or something like that. The European Union won't fund research on the types of questions we're discussing. I mean, I left Europe in despair in 2009 and headed off to Hong Kong. There isn't funding for anything that questions the existing order. There isn't freedom of thought. You won't get put in a concentration camp or murdered for expressing the kind of views that I'm expressing, but you won't get any funding or support. Yeah. So my views are quite radical. I'm in Beijing as a matter of choice.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much for this enriching and interesting discussion, and see you in a few days. We are very grateful to you.
Thank you so much for your questions, and I really enjoyed, despite the constrictions of Zoom, that we have had quite a lively discussion, and I'm very grateful for it, and grateful to you, Vladislav, for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
And our next speaker is Mostafa, who is from Iran, and who will talk about Islamic law and its influence on investment relations in the Middle East. I can introduce you if you don't mind. Я могу тебя представить, но yeah, we can see it. Okay.
Yes, I have some words here. My name is Mostafa, and I'm from Iran, and I'm docent here, associate professor in Ufa University of Science and Technology, Institute of Law, and more I'm focusing on international investment law, and recently I'm doing my research about the Middle East and also the financial relationships here, and also the impacts of Islamic law on these relations and the interconnection between them with the international dispute resolution and settlement as well. So I'm going to speak about here, as you see this topic, international dispute settlement and Middle East. Does Islamic doctrine play a big role? I want to speak about Sharia law, because if you speak about Islamic doctrine, it's not only the legal issues, but other matters as well can be considered under the Islamic doctrine. By the way, in the Middle East, in recent days, as the Middle East, you see growth as a hub for international dispute settlement. And the role of Islamic doctrine doctrine, or especially Sharia law, in the legal affairs of this region, I mean, the Middle East, is becoming an increasing cause for concern. So, if I want to tell you about the active role and presence of modern Arab states, which states I try to speak about? Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, in this part of the Middle East, that they are trying to make significant role for themselves in international relations and also international law, and trying to attract international actors to this region as well. So their efforts in these days and in the current society are related to international dispute settlement. As I saw, they try to make some centers. Like, if I give you some examples here, like Saudi Arabian Center for Commercial Arbitration introduced recently an international court in 2022 and revamped the rules in 2023. And also Dubai International Arbitration Center introduced revamped rules in 2022. Also in February 2024, the Abu Dhabi International Arbitration Center published modern institutional rules for international dispute settlement. And also Qatar, as another model country here, Qatar International Court. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the slides are not changing if you are changing them. We still have the first one.
Yes, because it's still introduction. Yes, then I change it. Do you? Okay, I speak about this as well, but a bit later. It's introduction right now. And Qatar International Court and Dispute Resolution Center is another one that tried to introduce new arbitration act in recent years, in 2017. However, the Sharia law is the main issue here. As you see here, and I would like to precisely speak about, is impact of Sharia law on settling international disputes. As I saw and as I got on my research, I saw 3 stages that the Sharia law has impacts on the international dispute settlement. And I listed them here. You can see, but I explain it a bit more to be clarified. The first step or first stage is about establishment of dispute settlement centers. And I told you some of them that recently Saudi Arabia tried to have new one. And also, I didn't mention it here, but Oman as another country that tried in 2024 to have new international court. And when you see these centers, they are based on Sharia law. Why? Because the main culture and main rule in these countries are based on Sharia. So the main sources of Sharia are Quran and Sunnah. And as an example here, I mentioned Al-Quran, Surah An-Nisa, ayah or verse 35 is about arbitration. Many of the jurists, Islamic jurists, when they try to speak about arbitration, definitely they go through this verse as well. What is this verse? The Muslim believe that Quran is the word of Allah. And when they say this is word of Allah, so they try to use it, but not exactly like the first version. Maybe by managing it and bringing this verse. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإن خفتم شقاق بينهما فابعثوا حكما من أهله وحكما من أهلها إن يريد إصلاحا يوفق الله بينهما. This hakam that I mentioned here 2 times, it means arbitration, and God encouraged people to solve their dispute in soft manner and settling it peacefully. So definitely the jurists go through this in Arab countries, and we see these centers are based on this text and Sharia law. The second stage that I got, it is national laws and courts in the process of settling international disputes. Our countries, as I mentioned, are based on Sharia law. And it means that procedural rules and also substantive rules are based on Sharia law. If I want to tell you 2 examples that I mentioned here, Article 7 of the Constitution of United Arab Emirates is speaking about the Sharia, and states the Sharia is the main source of legislation in this country. And also Saudi Arabia, in its constitution, states in Article 1 states that Quran and Sunnah are the country's constitution. It's so important in significant role. So what is the relationship between this national law or this Sharia law as a constitution in these countries and international dispute settlement, especially arbitration here? I will give you 2 examples, and in short, I mentioned here, first, seat of international arbitration. When you speak about seat of international arbitration, this is a location selected by parties as the legal place of arbitration, which consequently determines the procedural framework of the arbitration. So, if we imagine the seat of arbitration is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, then the procedural rules of Riyadh, which are based on Sharia, are also observed. And the second one, I want to go through the international agreements. Some international commercial and economic agreements, like bilateral investment treaties, referring to domestic courts as prerequisite for international arbitration. So, if a dispute between the parties needs to be referred to national courts of the Arab countries of Middle East, here the substantive and procedural rules are based on Sharia law. So this is mentioned by the manuals for economic activities in the Middle East, which published by United States Department of State in 2023 and 2024, which have explicitly stated that the judicial system of Arab states is based on Sharia law. So they don't say any other thing, just they say it's based on Sharia law, but they don't analyze that this Sharia law maybe make some problematic issue for some foreigners that they don't know how much is important here. And the third stage I would like to speak about is enforcement of international arbitration awards. The main concern raised regarding the Sharia is that may make it difficult to enforce arbitral awards in this region, in these Arab countries, because there's always the risk that the award will be deemed non-compliant with Sharia principle or Sharia laws, and so be found to be contrary to policy and unenforceable. So, based on the constitution, it's like public policy for the society. And the modern Arab states are signatories to these Arab states that I mentioned, these 6 Arab states, are signatories to the New York Convention. Based on the Article 5, Part 2B of the convention, is open to all signatories, signatory states to refuse to enforce a foreign arbitral award on the basis that the award is contrary to state's public policy. So the states can do it, can reject it, can refuse to enforce this award. So, for example, Article 78 of the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods impose an obligation to pay interest to remedy the aggregate loss for late payment. So this is interest. This interest, this word, this institution is considered as riba in Islam and is forbidden under Sharia law. Because of that, this article, Article 78, was heavily criticized by the Muslim representative at the Vienna Diplomatic Conference in 1980. But through these years, they didn't do anything. They can't bring any comprehensive set of rules that only for Muslims, only for Sharia law. But in recently in 2021, there was an attempt that was made to address this issue by Asia International Arbitration Center by developing the I arbitration rules. What is this prefix I? This I stands for compliance with the Islamic law. It means it's based on the model of United Nations Commission on International Trade Model Law for arbitration, but on the other hand, is in accordance with Sharia law. And just some examples here, if I want to tell you, is, for example, penalties for late payment. That is based on interest, but in this I arbitration rules, we have gharama. Gharama is the institution based on Islamic Sharia. And also the compensation in Sharia is ta'viz and is free of interest. And also about the calculating the rate of profit awards, they don't go through the conventional interest rates, but they go through Islamic money market that is set up by the Bank Negara Malaysia, that is Islamic one. So these 3 steps, you see that they have impact on the international dispute settlement. As a conclusion, if I want to tell you, I would like to say, really, imagination, international dispute settlement in Middle East, at least right now in current society, without effects of Islamic doctrine, is not possible. Because the society is in the way of Islamic law, and even maybe you see the Bin Salman, the Prince Bin Salman, as the new ruler of this country, try to make some moderation in this country. But still, by this moderation, still we have Islamic law as main set of rules and Sharia law as well. So at least at this moment, we have these impacts on international disputes. Большое спасибо за внимание. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and maybe colleagues, maybe we have some questions to ask our speaker. Да, пожалуйста, please.
Thank you.
Abdul Kadir.
Yes, if I may. Thanks a lot. I think this is a very interesting and indeed relevant discussion for this day. And I've recently had a meeting with the chairman of the Saudi Commercial Arbitration Center a couple of weeks ago, and we've been discussing this topic. I was particularly interested if they are trying to push Sharia and expand and further, do research on how Sharia interrelates with arbitration and other means of dispute resolution. And I left the meeting with an impression that they're more interested in finding a balanced approach to increase the foreign investors in the country. So they're basically saying that Sharia is not really an obstacle, even though it is a part of Saudi public policy and it indeed affects arbitration and its outcome. They're saying that the level of decisions that were annulled on the basis of Sharia is the number is very little, and that's why they're more interested in saying that it is not an obstacle rather than interested in developing rules of Sharia with regard to international dispute resolution. And it seems that there's little research on this, on the subject.
Thank you so much. Any question, just or your opinion?
Yeah.
Yes.
My question is that do you think that there's a lack of research in this area, so that we don't see legal research related to how arbitration in Islam actually works from the inside, according to the Islamic sources of law?
Oh, yes, thank you so much, Abdul Qadir. I hope I called you true. And it was great. Yes, exactly. You are right. Right now, we don't have so many scholars that they focus on these issues, and many of the objects of the subject needed to be clarified, and we don't know. For example, it was interesting for me that when I started to search about it, for example, about my research in general is about international investment law and the relationship with the Islamic doctrine. So I tried to see the national rules and national law of all these modern Arab states. For example, national investment law of Saudi Arabia. And it was interesting that in Saudi Arabia, for foreigners as well, we have the tax system that is based on Sharia law, and we call it zakat. And this zakat is part of the tax in this country. And none of the foreigners know about this. And I wanted more, I'm wondering, still we have lack of information about it, and really I saw we have lack of information. Why? Because I searched many of the manuals and guidelines, because manuals and guidelines are some textbooks for investors or the economic operation that the foreign states try to establish and publish them, like Australia, like China, like UK, and you can find it if search in the internet. And through all of them that I searched, that many of these countries, they try to clarify the way for their investors. Just only I saw the United States and Australia mentioned, for example, if you go to Middle East and if you try to invest in some Arab countries, be aware of the legal system, because the legal system is in the way of Sharia and is in accordance with Sharia. So no other information. So it's based on Sharia. What is happening? What should I do as investor? So what's happening? And you know, right now, many of the companies, law firms in these countries, they are working just to clarify the way for the investors that Sharia law is so important here. Sharia law is like constitution. And I mentioned earlier that maybe you think right now the United Arab Emirates, the Qatar, Saudi Arabia try to make the Islam more moderate, but still you see the impacts of Sharia law. Why? Because the society is based on Sharia law, because the culture of society is in this regard. And when we speak about the culture, all the set of rules in that society are based on the culture of society, and you can separate them. So yes, you are right. This is lack of information in this regard.
You agree?
Look, Mustafa, I have a question for you.
Yes. Thank you.
Of course, the traditional Islamic law is very important for the Muslim countries. And let's imagine the situation, for example, Iranian investor have a dispute with the Saudi Arabian entity in arbitration, say, established in United Arab Emirates. Okay, and and the only arbiter is the Arab who is traditionally Sunni, but Iranian investor belongs to Shiite part of Islam. Whether there could be some risk of taking final solution in favor of Arab counterpart in such a dispute. So there is some, to my mind, there is some tricky issue that the contradictions between Shiites and Sunnis can impact on such a arbitration decision.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. It's not only about the Shi'i and Sunni, because if you see about the schools in Sunni as well, we have Hanafi, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Maliki, and they have some special rules for themselves. But if I want to tell you some words here, it's not exactly related to my mind and what am I thinking about the religion and what the arbitrator thinks about it. But it's about the legal rules of the country. And if you choose to have your seat of arbitration in United Arab Emirates or in Saudi Arabia, so it means you accepted the procedural rules of that country. And about the substantive rules, so maybe there is some agreements because it's based on the investment relationships and they have some investment contracts or some other agreements based on the economic operation that they have, that they mentioned substantive rules and in the case of disputes. So it's not so problematic issue related to my mindset and the mindset of the arbitrator, but it's related to that national law that the investor must know about the national law. And if I want to tell you some other examples, for example, in the Saudi Arabian arbitration takes not code of international investment law of this country. I got they have some rules that the of foreign states can't invest in some special operation related to Mecca and Medina because this is Islamic cities. And this must be for the nationals of the Saudi Arabia or the Muslims, because they know the significant this part of the cities are so important for the Muslims, and they know they must observe it, respect it. So you see these details maybe bring some problems, or maybe you have to enforce the award, but at the end, some policy of Islamic Republic of Iran or some policy of Saudi Arabia stop it, refuse to enforce it. Thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mostafa.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
very much. We can go to other speaker, to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Я перейду на русский, если можно. Коллеги, тема моего выступления – территориальные титулы на Ближнем Востоке. Ну, первый тезис состоит в том, что само понятие Ближний Восток обсуждалось в арбитражном деле в споре о воздушном сообщении между США и Францией, и суд предусмотрительно отказался давать собственное определение этому региону. Он использовал понятие договора и сделал вывод, что Ближний Восток не включает в себя Иран и Турцию. Но если переходить уже к существу темы, то я хотел бы сказать, что всего у нас было 5 споров с участием арабских государств или ближневосточных государств, которые были рассмотрены в международных судах. Первый спор – это спор, который касается самоопределения Западной Сахары. Я напомню, что в данном споре суд отверг аргументы Марокко и Мавритании, сказал, что те связи, которые существовали между султаном Марокко и местными племенами в доколониальный период, они не могут рассматриваться как территориальные связи, как связи территориального суверенитета, точнее. И поэтому решил применить принцип самоопределения в форме создания независимого государства. Во втором деле, второе дело нас мало интересует, это одно из первых дел, даже, по-моему, первое дело о делимитации континентального шельфа, когда суд применил метод эквидистанции относимых обстоятельств. Оно интересно с точки зрения морского права, с точки зрения региональной динамики совершенно неинтересно. Очень, очень важное, на мой взгляд, одно из самых недооцененных судебных решений – это арбитраж по спору между Эритреей и Йеменом о делимитации в Красном море. 3 момента я бы отметил в этом решении. Первый момент – это то, что в этом деле суд применил исламское право. Суд, состоящий из британских арбитров, из Хиггинс, в частности, применил исламское право и признал права традиционного рыболовства за населением, проживающим на обоих берегах Красного моря. То есть он делимитировал морское пространство, но признал, что местное население обладает правом на ведение кустарного рыболовства на всем пространстве этой акватории. Второе дело, оно немного походит на заключение по Западной Сахаре. Здесь правительство Бахрейна ссылалось на узы личной преданности между, ну вот на карте можно увидеть, между шейхом Бахрейна в XIX веке и племенем Наим, которое занимало вот эту территорию Зубары, небольшого поселения. Суд, однако, сказал, что эти узы личной лояльности не означают, что племя Наим действовало в качестве представителя политической власти Бахрейна. То есть он отказался учитывать вот эту связь, которая не совсем соответствует тому, что в западном международном праве называется термином суверенитет. И во второй части своего решения он присудил спорные острова Хавар, которые, видите, находятся, ну, по сути, это часть Катара территориально, небольшие 2 пролива отграничивают. Он присудил эти острова Бахрейну на том основании, что английское правительство в 1939 году приняло соответствующее решение, и Катар, он не признал это решение, но он попросил об этом решении. И когда он попросил, он как бы заранее согласился с его юридической силой. И у нас есть несколько дел, которые касаются Палестины. Я совсем не хочу сегодня трогать эту тему очень большую. И перейду дальше. Следующий сюжет состоит в том, что у нас есть несколько неразрешенных споров. Они мало известны у нас. Для востоковедов они, наверное, более известны. Для юристов они неизвестны. Некоторые из них неинтересны с точки зрения международного права. Некоторые из них, наоборот, интересные. Но вот, в частности, у нас есть вопросы о треугольнике Халаиба. В свое время его англичане признали, что он принадлежит Египту. Потом они отдали эту территорию Судану в обмен на... А Египту выделили небольшой треугольничек, параллелепипед точнее, Биртавиль. А уже в 20 веке, после приобретения независимости, Египет себе эту территорию вернул. И здесь нюанс этого дела состоит в том, что Бертавиль в результате этого стал терранулиус, то есть ничейной территорией. Если кто-то из этих двух государств на него будет претендовать, это автоматически означает отказ от треугольника Халаиба. Но это скорее парадокс, чем действительно юридическая проблема. Затем у нас есть треугольник Келеби. Здесь у нас Кения некогда, точнее британцы, которые управляли Кенией, некогда осуществляли патрулирование этого района для того, чтобы защитить суданские племена кочевые, которые проживали на этой территории. Ну а после приобретения независимости Кения решила сохранить контроль и стала обозначать вот эту линию патруля, синюю 1947 года, как международную границу. А вот так. Затем у нас есть вопрос о суверенных территориях, о территориях, которые находятся под суверенитетом Испании, но локализованы в Африке или на Ближнем Востоке. С точки зрения международного права возникает такой интересный вопрос, можно ли к этим территориям применить принцип права нации на самоопределение. Можно ли их рассматривать как колонии, с учетом того, что они были приобретены задолго до того, как у нас начался процесс колонизации. Или это не колония? Ну, я скорее думаю, что второе. Затем у нас есть многоаспектное и крайне интересное дело Абу Маса и Тумбы. У меня недавно вышла статья в журнале международного правосудия. Я там разбираю аргументы сторон. Ну, правда, в данном случае, скорее всего, на стороне Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов. Иран использует самые разнообразные аргументы, но эти аргументы в основном не юридического толка. Тоже я чуть попозже там попытаюсь это суммировать. И у нас есть вопрос о Хатае. Это территория, которая во времена мандата Турция путем проведения референдума, который некоторые считают сфальсифицированным, забрала эту территорию себе. И Сирия до недавнего времени ее оспаривала. Ну, оспаривала не эксплицитно, а просто на сирийских картах эта территория иногда изображалась как принадлежащая Сирии. Вот, теперь я перехожу к умозаключениям. Сначала несколько слов о предпосылках вот этих конфликтов, которые существуют на Ближнем Востоке. Самая главная предпосылка – это решение метрополии, прежде всего Великобритании. Именно Великобритания, именно ее решение сгенерировали спор между Египтом и Суданом, между Ираном и Объединенными Арабскими Эмиратами, между Кенией и Суданом и так далее. И можно, наверное, еще несколько примеров привести. Вторая предпосылка – это решение международного сообщества. Это решение ООН в отношении Палестины. Это, прежде всего, вот эта известная или печально известная резолюция 181. И дальнейшие решения, которые призывали к переговорам, а не к восстановлению справедливости. Третья предпосылка – это ксенофобия. Это отношение к другим как к низшим и как к чуждым. Эта риторика используется израильскими авторами, когда они пытаются обосновать оккупацию голландских высот, западного берега, операции в Газе. Они иногда говорят, что палестинцы не являются нацией, они являются частью арабской нации, они не способны жить в мире, ислам противоречит порядку, ну и тому подобные аргументы. Четвертая группа причин, я бы назвал это термином пульсации империй, это попытки больших государств, великих в прошлом, опереться на свой исторический опыт, на старые карты и претендовать на те территории, которые с точки зрения современного международного права являются чужими. Этот феномен свойственен не только Ближнему Востоку, конечно. И пятый феномен очень интересный, на мой взгляд, мало исследованный. Это несовместимость современного международного права и традиционной политической культуры региона. Ну вот я уже один пример этой несовместимости привел. Это противоречие между концепцией территориального суверенитета и концепцией личной лояльности. И проблема в данном случае состоит в том, что что международные суды и доктрина не пытаются эти концепции совместить, не пытаются провести между ними параллели. Вот. Теперь, что касается риторики. Что касается риторики, то у нас есть 5 групп аргументов. Некоторые из них основываются на международном праве, но большинство не основываются. Первая группа аргументов – это аргументы, которые основаны на исторических правах. Мы можем взять в кавычки исторические права. Это доводы Ирана в отношении Каспийского моря, в отношении двух спорных островов в Ормузском проливе. Это доводы Израиля в отношении Палестины. Интересно, коллеги, может быть, кто-то из вас читал решение, консультативное заключение 24 года. Там был такой небольшой, но очень забавный сюжет. В решении написано: некоторые участники судебного процесса сослались на исторические права Израиля в отношении Палестины. Суд не может вынести суждение по этому вопросу, поскольку даже если такие права имеются, доказательства этих прав суду не были предоставлены. Ну, я так от себя могу сказать, что в 1880 году на территории Палестины проживало 5%, 5% еврейского населения, 20 тысяч примерно из 400. В этом смысле аргумент, состоящий в том, что евреи там всегда жили, он, ну, такой выглядит не очень состоятельным, не соответствует вот статус-кво, я бы так сказал. В этом смысле, я так могу продлить эту логику, на территории вот этой спорной провинции Хатай армяне в момент ее отчуждения от Сирии к Турции составляли 11%. Ну, то есть это кусочек киликийской Армении. В этой логике получается, что армяне могут претендовать на эту территорию. Вот. И вторая группа аргументов – это антиколониализм. Иран, например, говорит, что вот эти спорные острова в Ормузском проливе были отторгнуты у него не арабскими государствами, а Великобританией. Поэтому их возвращение обратно Ирану – это восстановление не только исторической справедливости, это еще и реституция, как форма международной ответственности. Третья группа аргументов основана на культурном превосходстве. Тоже это очень любопытно, и есть параллели с правом. Иран, например, говорит, что арабские государства в принципе не могут претендовать на какие-либо спорные территории, потому что эти территории никогда не были их. А если они когда-то, арабские государства, и устанавливали контроль в отношении этих территорий, то нужно вспомнить, кем они были, вот эти арабские образования. Это были шейхства, которые занимались пиратством, которые занимались разбоем, работорговлей. И их конституциализация как независимых суверенных государств состоялась только благодаря Великобритании и только в конце XIX века. Это логика Ирана. Арабские государства в основном используют правовые конструкции. Некоторые из этих правовых конструкций, коллеги, оказываются непригодными. Вот тоже я сошлюсь на вот это дело, я не сказал об этом. Эритрея, Йемен, где суд сначала попытался применить концепцию суверенитета in abeyance, это Лозаннский договор, где было написано, что территориальная принадлежность этих островов не будет определена, пока стороны не решат иначе. Стороны так и не решили. Потом суд попытался посмотреть на концепцию эффективности, то есть осуществляли ли Эритрея и Йемен территориальный контроль после приобретения независимости. Он не смог сделать выводы какие-то на основании этого. И наконец, он применил, и это тоже уникальный случай в истории международного правосудия, концепцию смежности. То есть, он отдал эти острова тем государствам, которым они находятся ближе территориально. В этом можно увидеть параллели с логикой Российской Федерации в отношении Арктики. Это тоже очень интересная риторика. Ну и, наконец, повторюсь, что в некоторых аргументах у нас используются тезисы или доводы, основанные на шариате. И, как показал опыт вот этого процесса Эритрея и Йемен, использование шариата может оказывать очень благотворное влияние на разрешение спора. И последний слайд, коллеги, я бы хотел сделать коротко несколько выводов. Первый вывод состоит в том, что существует определение Ближнего Востока как underclass международного порядка. Есть такое очень хорошее сравнение, что арабские государства относятся к международному праву, как преступники относятся к уголовному кодексу. Они все право видят как уголовный кодекс. они не видят ничего в праве, что могло бы им помочь, что могло бы их защитить. Они видят в международном праве только репрессивный инструмент. Отсюда недоверие. Второй тезис состоит в том, что современное международное право не предлагает эффективных решений эффективных инструментов для решения конфликтов, существующих на Ближнем Востоке. Более того, существующие инструменты, не буду конкретизировать, если будут вопросы, с удовольствием это сделаю. Существующие инструменты усугубляют эти конфликты. Третий вывод состоит в том, что необходимо подумать над тем, как адаптировать местную правовую и культурную традицию к международному праву. Ну, я уже тоже пример этот привел. Может быть, нам нужно расширительно толковать некоторые местные правовые феномены, такие как личная лояльность или такие как традиционные права. Четвертый вывод, он состоит в том, что существующие институциональные механизмы, большинство из которых сосредоточено в ООН, недостаточно для урегулирования этой проблемы. То есть сегодня уже понятно, что ООН, вот формат обсуждения в Совете Безопасности, формат решения в Генеральной Ассамблее не могут решить палестинскую проблему. Нужно что-то принципиально иное. Это что-то принципиально иное, на мой взгляд, может быть заимствовано из опыта, например, Лиги наций. Там совсем иначе решались территориальные проблемы. Так, ну и давайте я закончу над тем, что нам необходимо развивать национальную доктрину в этих государствах. К сожалению, международно-правовая доктрина в арабских странах очень слабая. Это видно и по статьям, и по тому, как отстаиваются интересы Палестины в международных судах. И три вещи еще в самом конце. Первое, на мой взгляд, регион Ближнего Востока не является с точки зрения международной специфики уникальным. Мне кажется, что есть очень большие параллели между тем, что происходит на Ближнем Востоке, тем, что происходит в Латинской Америке, и тем, что происходит или может происходить в Центральной Азии. Мы можем увидеть параллели. Эти параллели связаны с тем, что все три региона являются транзитными. Второй момент состоит в том, что вот у меня была как-то беседа с судьей Каромо, я его спросил, почему в Африке постоянно идут войны. Он сказал мне, это связано с тем, что население этих стран бедное, и отсюда рост агрессии. На это я ему попытался парировать и сказал, что вот посмотрите на Юго-Восточную Азию, там население тоже бедное, но политический порядок гораздо более устойчивый. И здесь наш разговор зашел в тупик. Сегодня я бы ответил бы на этот вопрос сам себе бы так. Мне кажется все-таки, что политическим структурам, которые существуют в этих регионах, идея государства чужда. Суверенитета, территориальной власти, позитивного права и так далее, и так далее, и так далее. Нам нужно искать в местных культурах какие-то нормы и какие-то институты, которые являются традиционными, что ли. Вот тоже последняя самая. Была очень интересная статья, она давно была опубликована, лет 20 назад, и, на мой взгляд, тоже недооцененная. Автор, американский профессор, она писала о том, что нам не нужно пытаться привнести опыт европейских государств на Ближний Восток. Мы должны использовать уже существующие формы. Протекторат, опека, мандаты, племенные союзы. Не обязательно это может быть зависимость, это могут быть какие-то самостоятельные образования. Здесь важно то, что это должны быть институты, и то, что эти институты должны быть основаны на местной традиции. Спасибо, коллеги. Если есть один-два вопроса, я с удовольствием отвечу. Или, может быть, кто-то хочет поделиться своим мнением.
Владислав Леонидович, вопрос такой. Семенов Борис Станиславович, Бурятский государственный университет. Вы сказали, что позитивное право чуждо Востоку, а естественное?
Естественно, право. Здесь мы выходим на вопрос о соотношении ислама и международного права, о котором говорил Мустафа. Ислам, наверное, можно рассматривать как что-то, во всяком случае, как что-то более близкое к естественному праву, чем международное современное право. Есть несколько есть несколько фундаментальных противоречий между исламом и международным правом. Я их сейчас очень коротко обозначу. Первое противоречие состоит в том, что основным субъектом в исламе является умма. Не национальное государство, а умма, сообщество мусульман. В этом смысле, с точки зрения ислама, национальные государства являются нелегитимными. Есть умма и есть отдельные физические лица, которые ее образуют. Государства не существует. Второй момент состоит в том, что с точки зрения ислама весь мир делится на дар аль-харб и дар аль-ислам. Территория мира и территория войны. И джихад предполагает постоянную войну, которая может прерываться только на временные перемирия в интересах мусульман. То есть можно, конечно, сглаживать этот момент, можно его смягчать, но тем не менее он присутствует. Он пока еще не преодолен исламом. И третий момент состоит в том, что вот то, что говорил Мустафа, ислам оперирует таким понятием, как сияр. Сияр – это история о том, как Мухаммед разрешал конфликты, в том числе путем арбитража, между племенами, которые проживали в Медине. И здесь проблема состоит не в том, что это было давно, или в том, что какие-то использовались подходы, не соответствующие современному международному праву, а в том, что международное право нормативно, а не казуально. Международное право – это не кейс-ло. То есть с точки зрения методологического подхода ислам противоречит, структура ислама противоречит структуре международного права. Еще раз, это не содержательный конфликт, это конфликт методологический. Вот. То есть это тоже пример того, что применение ислама исключает международное право и наоборот. Вот. Нужно что-то адаптировать или нужно пытаться найти какой-то синтез. То есть, на мой взгляд, это такой далеко идущий вывод, я в нем не уверен. Здесь нет принципиального противоречия, но есть очень большой простор для работы, которая не ведется.
Спасибо.
Спасибо. Коллеги, все, да? Есть ли еще вопросы? Нет. Всех благодарю за присутствие и за вопросы. Мне кажется, мероприятие сегодня удалось.